Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Phyllis Summers had always relied on her instincts in Genoa City, and though those instincts had often led her down paths that left destruction in their wake, they had also kept her alive, sharp, and forever one move ahead of anyone trying to play the game better than she could, which was why on this particular afternoon, as she sat in the Grand Phoenix reviewing emails from investors and project updates, something in her gut told her she should check her hotel suite. Something small, indescribable, a tightening in the chest that told her she wasn't as alone in the hotel as she believed. So she silently closed her laptop, stood up, heels clicking softly across her suite floor, and paused just outside the bedroom doorway to listen, only to hear the faint scrape of a chair and a quiet muttered curse, which confirmed everything she needed to know. Someone was in her room, and not just anyone, someone at her desk, and that desk held not just business plans and budgets but highly sensitive digital files, blueprints, contract evaluations, and everything related to her new corporate strategies that could be used against her if found by the wrong hands. She pushed the door open and wasn't even surprised when she found Kane Ashby sitting in front of her laptop, fingers still over the keyboard like a child caught stealing cookies. And the look on his face was one she remembered all too well from their past clashes. Guilt mixed with fear, mixed with indignation that she had caught him at all. Kane immediately tried to stand and stammer an excuse, something about thinking he heard a ping from the computer and assuming a message came in that might require immediate attention. But Phyllis wasn't buying it for a second. She crossed her arms, lifted her chin, and fired back with a voice as cold and sharp as cut glass, demanding to know what he thought he was doing snooping in her files. And Kane, realizing excuses wouldn't work on someone with Phyllis's lie-detecting radar side, took a slow breath and confessed that he was looking for leverage, something to help him stabilize his position in the corporate world after weeks of uncertainty with Chancellor Winters and painful political maneuverings that left him unsure of who he could trust. But Phyllis wasn't moved, because she had worked too hard to rebuild her empire and refused to be yet again the stepping stone in someone else's comeback. What stung her even more was that Kane, of all people, someone who had suffered through lies and scandals of his own, someone who had once sworn that trust mattered above all else, had come crawling into her suite behind her back, convinced that the only way to secure his future was to violate hers. She walked slowly toward him, each step deliberate, emphasizing that she held all the power in the room, and informed him that breaking into her hotel suite and trying to access confidential files was not just unethical but potentially criminal, and she could have him arrested right then and there if she wanted. An option she seemed to be weighing as she watched him squirm, speechless for the first time in a long while. Kane, however, wasn't ready to fold. Desperation can make a man bold, and he pleaded his case, saying that he needed information to protect himself from enemies inside the company, and that he believed Phyllis might be involved in something he should know about, particularly given her sudden new business partnerships that had stirred rumors across town. But she wasn't buying the innocent act, because she knew what it looked like when someone wasn't searching for truth but advantage, and Kane had already shown his hand. His fear, his guilt, and his ambition were written all over his face. But unbeknownst to Kane, the situation was about to become drastically more painful for him, because at that very moment Lily Winters, his longtime love, his estranged partner, and the person whose opinion mattered most to him in the world, was on her way to the Grand Phoenix with news that would shake Kane's already fragile world to its core. Phyllis, ever perceptive, knew that Kane's downfall had already begun before her confrontation even started, and when she heard the elevator doors open down the hall, followed by the unmistakable sound of Lily's determined footsteps, she allowed herself a small smile, not triumphant, not cruel, but the smile of someone who understood timing better than most and recognized that sometimes a person's choices unravel them without her needing to lift a finger. Lily entered the suite moments later, took one look at Kane and Phyllis standing opposite one another, and the exhaustion on her face showed that whatever she had come to say wasn't light, wasn't easy, and wasn't something Kane would walk away from without a scar. She didn't even ask what was happening. She could see the open laptop, Kane's guilty expression, and the atmosphere crackling with tension, and Lily, having lived with Kane long enough to recognize the signs of his panic and scheming, closed her eyes briefly before opening them again, steady and resolute, making it clear she was done protecting him from himself. She turned to Phyllis first, thanking her for stepping aside and giving her a moment alone with Kane, and Phyllis, sensing that what was coming would be devastating, stepped back but didn't leave the room, choosing instead to watch quietly because she wanted Kane to see that the consequences of his decisions came from every direction, not just hers. Lily's voice was calm when she began, but the words themselves were daggers disguised as silk. She told Kane that she had heard from corporate legal, HR, and the board, and that the situation had reached the point where the company could no longer shield him, because while he had been scrambling for leverage, trying to gain access to confidential files, and attempting to save his position, his actions had been noticed, documented, investigated, and tied back to a pattern of questionable decisions that included financial mismanagement, improper use of company resources, and now apparently unauthorized attempts to breach confidential information from outside business entities such as Phyllis's. Kane stood there frozen as Lily explained that the board had decided to terminate his corporate involvement entirely, and to restrict his access to company files, financial accounts, and ongoing projects. He tried to interrupt, insisting he had done everything for the sake of protecting the company and his role within it, but Lily held up a hand and stopped him, her voice cracking for the first time as she told him that she had believed in him longer than anyone else, defended him when others thought he was unpredictable, unstable, and impulsive, and stood by him when she had every reason not to, but now she realized she couldn't continue standing beside a man who kept undermining his own integrity and dragging her reputation down with him. Kane's face shifted from panic to denial to pleading, trying desperately to reach Lily emotionally, but this time Lily's decision was final, not fueled by anger but exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who had carried a burden too long. Phyllis watched the scene unfold with a mixture of sympathy and grim understanding, because she knew this kind of moment well. When someone realizes the person they thought they knew is no longer someone they can support without losing parts of themselves. She cleared her throat and told Kane quietly that this could have gone differently, that he didn't have to break into her laptop or treat her like a threat when she could have been an ally, but Kane, already overwhelmed by Lily's announcement, barely heard her words. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair, insisting the board was overreacting, that Lily could talk to them, that this didn't have to be the end. But before he could finish the plea, Lily cut him off with finality, telling him she wasn't going to defend behavior that was becoming habitual, erratic, and reflective of someone who refused to take responsibility for their actions. It wasn't anger, it was heartbreak, the kind that comes after someone finally realizes they can't fix another person no matter how hard they try. She told him she needed to protect her own future, her own career, and her own self-respect. Kane's eyes finally lifted to meet Phyllis's, and he realized with dawning horror that the woman he had tried to deceive was now the witness to his humiliation, and that made it worse because Phyllis had always had a front-row seat to the complicated messes of Genoa City relationships, but rarely was she on the receiving end of betrayal this simple and foolish. She told Kane she wasn't going to press charges, not yet at least, but she warned him that if any trace of her files ended up in corporate discussions or if anyone attempted to use her business plans as ammunition, she would take immediate legal action and go public with the story, and Kane believed her because Phyllis didn't make empty threats. He slumped into the desk chair, the very place where moments earlier he thought he might uncover victory, and now it was the seat of complete defeat. Lily turned away, unable to look at him any longer, and Kane called her name softly, begging her to reconsider, but she only shook her head, telling him that she needed space, clarity, and a life not defined by someone else's chaos. The crushing blow wasn't delivered in a scream or a slap. It was delivered in quiet truth, which made it cut even deeper. Phyllis finally approached Kane, placing her hand gently on the back of the chair, not in comfort but in acknowledgement that she had seen this collapse coming long before he realized how unstable the ground beneath him had become. She told him that Genoa City may forgive flaws and mistakes, but it never forgave weakness disguised as manipulation. She explained that if Kane wanted a future here, he needed to step back, rebuild himself honestly, and stop trying to cheat his way into relevance. Kane listened, but whether he would change was a question even Lily couldn't answer anymore. Lily walked toward the door, pausing only once to tell Kane goodbye. Not forever, but goodbye to the version of him she could no longer carry. She left the room with trembling shoulders but steady steps, and Kane, alone now except for Phyllis's silent presence, lowered his head into his hands. The empire he was trying so desperately to hold together had collapsed from the inside, and the woman he cared about most had finally reached her breaking point. Phyllis closed the laptop, locked it, and walked away as Kane remained still, realizing too late that the moment he chose deception over trust was the moment he lost everything that mattered. Kane Ashby remained in the chair long after Lily's footsteps had faded down the hallway of the Grand Phoenix, and the silence that followed was brutal, far more deafening than any screaming match or boardroom takedown could ever have been, because it forced him to sit with the truth without distraction, without defense, without a single excuse left to give, and in that moment, he finally understood what Lily had meant when she said she could no longer carry the consequences of his decisions. She had not walked out because she lacked love for him, but because she had realized that she was drowning in the tidal waves he kept creating, and Kane, for the first time in too long, felt what it meant to be completely alone. Phyllis stood near the windows of the suite, arms folded, watching Genoa City glitter beneath neon reflections and late-night traffic, a city that never stopped judging, never stopped watching, always ready to elevate one person and destroy another within the same breath. And she realized that Kane was not only at a career crossroads but a personal breaking point, one that could send him spiraling if he refused to learn something from the wreckage before him. She turned back to him, her voice softer than before but still sharp with clarity, asking him whether he truly understood what had just happened. Not the confrontation she had had with him, not the snooping, not even the corporate repercussions, but the emotional finality in Lily's voice when she said she needed a life without his chaos, and Kane swallowed hard before admitting that he wasn't sure he had ever believed Lily would reach that place, because no matter what had gone wrong between them in the past, she had always forgiven him, always given him another chance, always found the strength to help him clean up whatever disaster he had created, and now seeing the look in her eyes, he understood that the one person who had always fought for him had finally stopped fighting. Phyllis sat down across from him, not out of sympathy but because she had lived through similar turning points, moments when someone who meant everything had finally drawn a line, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much and needed to survive themselves, and she told Kane that if he wanted any hope of fixing things with Lily, he had to stop focusing on damage control in the company and start understanding the damage he had caused emotionally, something he had always convinced himself he could smooth over later, because later was gone now, and the only thing left was what he did next. Kane took a long breath, rubbing his face with trembling hands, and confessed that he didn't know why he had done half the things he had done lately, acknowledging that fear had been driving him for months, fear of being pushed out of Chancellor Winters, fear of becoming obsolete in a business world that was evolving faster than his instincts could adapt, fear of being remembered as someone who had peaked and then fallen apart rather than someone who built something lasting, something his children could be proud of. Phyllis listened, and though she wasn't one to coddle anyone, she recognized the panic in his voice because she had lived it, more than once, when the world was ready to cut her out and pretend she never existed. And she told him plainly that every successful player in Genoa City had faced that precipice. Victor had faced it when Newman Enterprises was threatened from the inside. Jack had faced it when Jabot nearly slipped through his fingers. She herself had faced it a dozen times when every mistake she had ever made came back to swallow her whole, but the difference between players who survived and players who disappeared was how they responded when their back hit the wall. She leaned forward and told Kane that snooping wasn't strategic. It was desperate, and the corporate sharks in this town could smell desperation from a mile away. If Kane wanted to survive this, he needed to rebuild his credibility from zero, not through shortcuts, not through schemes, not through covert searches for leverage, but through accountability, ownership, and a willingness to stop pretending he was the only person in the room fighting for something meaningful. Kane stood up abruptly, pacing the room, admitting that he might have already gone too far, because Lily wasn't someone who made empty emotional threats. If she said she was stepping away to protect herself, she meant it, and Kane feared that meant she was gone for good. Phyllis told him it wasn't necessarily permanent. Lily had a long track record of forgiving, but she only forgave after someone had proven they deserved it, not asked for it, and right now Kane hadn't proven anything except that he was still capable of blowing up his own life faster than anyone else could sabotage him. She told him that if he wanted to salvage anything, he needed to stop sitting in the fallout and start doing the uncomfortable work, owning what he had done, resigning from whatever positions were being torn away anyway, facing the board before they chased him out publicly, apologizing to Lily without asking her to fix anything, and most importantly, figuring out why he kept sabotaging himself every time he got close to stability. Before Kane could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door, and he froze, fearing that Lily had come back, only to have Phyllis shake her head and walk past him, opening the door to find Devon Hamilton standing there, jaw clenched, eyes burning with the kind of executive fury that only came when someone had just spent several hours putting together an emergency crisis response ahead of a media leak. Devon stepped into the suite, not even bothering to wait for permission, and immediately demanded to know what Kane thought he was doing sneaking into Phyllis's files when Chancellor Winters already had enough internal scandal for the tabloids to feast on. Kane tried to defend himself, but Devon cut him off, saying that the board had already confirmed the decision to remove Kane from active involvement in the company, and that legal was preparing documentation as they spoke. Resignations, NDAs, non-disclosure reinforcement, and asset protections that would prevent Kane from doing additional damage on his way out the door. Kane's face went pale and Devon, normally measured and diplomatic, didn't bother softening his words because the situation had escalated beyond the point of gentle instruction. He told Kane that Lily had spent the last several months fighting internally for him, shielding him from scrutiny, convincing people that he was under pressure, that he would recover his stability, that he deserved patience beyond what the corporate world normally offered. But now that Lily had pulled her support, there was nothing left keeping him inside the walls of Chancellor Winters, and the board had moved swiftly to close the chapter. Phyllis stepped between them, not to defend Kane but to keep Devon from detonating the entire suite emotionally, because she could see Kane was already on the verge of shutting down completely, and she reminded Devon that while Kane had made a catastrophic mistake, he was still human and still processing the implosion of both his career and personal life within the same hour. Devon exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose, and admitted that the timing wasn't ideal. He didn't want to be the one delivering final blows, but the company couldn't afford compassion when news outlets were circling like vultures, waiting for any misstep that could imply instability within the corporate structure. Kane asked whether the board intended to make the decision public, and Devon told him the announcement would be phrased as a mutual separation, allowing Kane to save face in the press, so long as Kane himself did nothing in the next 24 hours to escalate matters. Kane nodded, acknowledging that he had already done enough damage, and didn't want to add gasoline to the fire. Devon, seeing Kane's sincerity finally cracking through his defensiveness, softened just slightly, saying that he didn't want to hate Kane and didn't want to see him destroyed. But Kane kept putting himself in positions that made loyalty impossible. He told Kane that if he wanted any future reconciliation or any chance to retain the respect of the business community, the next moves he made needed to be honest, humble, and transparent. Kane walked through the dimly lit streets of Genoa City with the weight of everything that had happened pressing heavily against his chest, and as he passed storefronts and familiar corners, places where he had once walked with Lily, laughing, talking about children, futures, dreams, he realized that somewhere along the line he had stopped thinking about the future as something he built with someone, and instead he had begun thinking of it as a battlefield he had to win alone, a shift subtle enough that he never noticed it happening, yet significant enough that it had cost him the woman who had always been his greatest ally. He paused at the park near the old coffee kiosk, remembering the nights he had met Lily there after long workdays, when she would tell him about Devon's latest business plan or Maddie's homework struggles or Charlie's soccer achievements, and he would feel grounded, connected, at peace, something he had not felt in far too long. He took a deep breath, admitting to himself that he had been terrified of being overshadowed by executives more polished than he was, terrified of being the man who never reached the top despite decades of effort, terrified that the world would see him the way he feared he truly was. Someone who kept getting chances but never fully learned from them. And yet even as these truths pressed into him, he knew that Lily would never have cared about any of that if he had simply trusted her enough to say it out loud. Instead, he had withdrawn, convinced himself that admitting vulnerability was the same as surrender, and now the absence of Lily's faith, her voice, her presence felt like a hollow echo inside his ribcage. Meanwhile, Lily herself had walked to Chancellor Winters after leaving the Grand Phoenix, needing movement to steady her trembling hands and calm the storm inside her. She slipped into her office quietly, the building nearly empty at this late hour, and sat at her desk, staring at the glowing city skyline through the darkened window. She had held herself together in front of Kane and Devon, but now that she was alone, the walls finally cracked. She wasn't angry so much as deeply saddened, exhausted from years of trying to believe that Kane would one day stop sabotaging his own life. She had forgiven emotional betrayals, professional missteps, and the kind of impulsive decisions that would have ended another man's career long ago, because she had always believed that Kane was a good man who simply didn't know how to stop panicking long enough to trust in himself. But this time watching him break into someone